again if you feel like it. Captions are available during the session by clicking on the live CC button at the bottom of your Zoom window. Thank you to our captioner, Christine Garanco, for providing these. Please use the Q&A feature for any presentation questions. Brian is going to have a few pauses during his presentation for questions, and so use the Q. You can choose to put your questions in anonymously, and we will also try to have 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A wrap up at the end of the presentation. Please use the chat for general comments or technical issues. Nicole Thomas is our wonderful tech monitor and will be monitoring the chat for any questions and comments. Nicole will also be adding in some links into chat. One is for the collaborative resource sharing site. If you have a related reading, podcast, video, or something else, please share it with us in COM's recommended resources document or in the chat. Due to Google Docs limitations, we ask that you close out of the document after you have added a resource. One of our volunteers will drop this information into chat, the link that is. The next link is our conference code of conduct. If needed, or please review that. That's all I have for logistics. And so we'll turn things over to Brian. So take it away, Brian.
Oh, well, thank you very much. I'm happy to present. I've got a lot of ground to cover, so I am going to move pretty quickly, but I do welcome your questions at the breaks. So again, my name is Brian Keith, and I work at the George A. Smathers Libraries at the University of Florida. And I would like to acknowledge the people whose land the University of Florida is occupying. And so I'll give you a second to read this slide. So for the presentation today, I'm going to start with some principles for equity and fairness, talk about salary administration, talk about faculty salary structure, a staff salary structure, and talk about how we maintain these over time. The idea is to share some case studies and to use those to where there's some practical takeaways, but also to where they show how we're delivering on sound salary plan administration and these principles of equity and fairness, so that you can have those to use at your library. So to begin with, principles. So you may be familiar with these terms, but I think it's important for us to make sure that we're on the same page. And there's two types of equity and two types of fairness that are baked into our work today. There's external equity, which means that people are paid comparably to what they would get paid at another organization. And there's internal equity, which is how different types of jobs and different people in jobs, even if they're similar, are treated within one organization. There's also two types of fairness that people have in mind, and that's the way in which pay is received, that's distributive justice, and procedural justice, which is that people think that the decision-making process are fair and consistent. And studies have shown that procedural fairness is considered most important for employees for their pay satisfaction. And so it also lends people's positive perspectives that their employer is trustworthy and that it values them. Both of them are important. So those are some kind of principle underpinnings, fairness and equity, some ideas for salary structures. Basically, the reasons that we have pay policies are to set pay levels in relation to other companies, to evaluate individual jobs, and so that we have coherent relationships among them, and then also determining the pay relationships among individual workers within the same job. So salary structures really get towards those equity and fairness issues. A salary structure is a system where jobs that are comparable are grouped into grades and they get competitive salaries. That's when it's working. And notably, your workplace, certainly at the Smathers Libraries, there can be more than one salary structure. And I'll show you a list of ours, so I'm only going to get to cover two of them. If you have a salary structure and you stick to it, it gives you organizational consistency And it also lets employees understand the lay of the land for their career development and also understanding how they're paid. And both of these, again, go back to fairness and equity. And as you may have experienced, if we make compensation decisions that are one-offs, if they're to pacify employees, there's higher operating costs, and it's also detrimental to fairness and equity, and people understand that. So what is a salary structure? So you have some elements of a salary structure, which I'll go through in a moment, but the integrity of all of these is in how you use it. So if you're consistent in implementing it in recruiting, in doing counter offers for people who work with you, promotions, lateral moves, and merit and across the board increases, you can have a salary structure, but if you aren't disciplined, you don't really have a salary structure. So the elements of a salary structure are these four, and you're going to see these in use. So the pay range is the minimum and the maximum rate of pay for employees in the same or similar jobs. And you've probably seen it expressed as pay grades. The width of the range is the percentage difference from the minimum to the maximum of a pay range. It varies, but typically it's narrower for lower pay grades. The rate minimum should attract qualified job candidates, while the rate maximum should allow you to retain people. And the range progression is the difference or the jump from one grade to the next. For example, a library associate 1 to a library associate 2. And these vary by position types, but they're typically smaller for lower paid pay grade positions. And they should be large enough to reflect the progression in increased compensable elements of the position. I'll talk about compensable elements in a moment. The range midpoints are used to orient salary levels. For example, more highly rated or more experienced employees will be above that midpoint. And generally for white collar workers, the midpoint represents the job's market value. And so compensable factors are any job attribute that can provide a basis for determining the worth of the job. And their use requires some decision makings regarding weights and degrees and levels. And you're going to hear more than enough about compensable factors. We use those a lot. And those are used to assign individual salaries within this salary structure. And so some of the employee-based compensable factors, ones that are about people, are their level of education or training, their experience, if they have certifications, special skills, knowledge, and abilities, or in the case of an academic unit like the Smathers Libraries, their rank. There are job-based compensable factors. And so I'll let you take a look at these. It would be how much supervision do you exercise? How much direction do you receive? How complex is the job? Types of working conditions, and all the way to language requirements, which is a compensable factor for a job that we use for our faculty. And so, like I said before, an organization can have multiple different salary structures. We have at least 9 at the George A. Smathers Libraries for these different populations. And I should say at the University of Florida librarians, a group of folks that are library faculty have tenure track status. And within that, there's deans, chairs, associate chairs. So we have a whole bunch. Regrettably, I'm really only gonna be able to talk about library assistants and associates and non-administrative faculty today. So this is one of those junctures where there's the opportunities for questions. Are there any questions about, the principles, fundamentals?
Yeah, Brian, there is one question that was been put in the Q&A, and just a reminder to folks to use the Q&A feature for if you do have questions when there are these breaks. The question is from Catherine, and what is being asked is, how do classified staff go about negotiating with higher ups to recategorize themselves as non-classified staff? As classified staff, we can't negotiate raises, but there's a more diverse range of salary as a non-classified staff.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about classifications and reclasses in a little bit later in the talk, because that's one of the ways in which you maintain a salary structure. So when I get to that, I'm going to talk about special pay increases, classifications, the way in which merit's allocated. And I hate it when people do this, but I would ask if it's okay, could you remind me of the question towards the end?
Yep, we can just keep it in the queue as unanswered and come back to it.
Okay. Are there any others?
So far, no. Oh, we just have a new one. Oh, they're all popping in now. Okay. Here's the question, an anonymous question. What do you do when you're in a union environment, but raises are done within the library? Whoops, I lost the question. But what do you do when you're in a union environment, but raises are done within the library, but it's unclear how they're being determined?
Yeah, I'm going to talk to you about the ways in which we determine those. I don't know if you're asking what do I do as an administrator, or what does one do? Fortunately at UF, we have a pretty strong tradition of the union and the university allowing us to do merit increases, but we also have experiences with across the board. And sometimes they have ones where they just adjust the minimum, and what we experience is compression into the system. If time permits, I would be happy to talk about that. But when I talk about maintaining, I'm going to be talking about setting up a system and then continuing to work on it.
We're getting another question that's getting a bunch of upvotes is you might be planning to address this later, but what recommendations do you have when you're working within a system with a salary structure that is not equitable, immense compression, very little movement within the range?
Yeah, what I'm going to lay out are the systems by which you can create the ability for people to move in that system, and you can encourage movement, because I think it creates coherence. One of the fundamental things is for people to have a sense of satisfaction and a belief that their employer is fair. And my reason, part of the practical reason for that an employer might have, is retention. And so I think that kind of addresses the recourse for employees. I think it also addresses the impetus for administrators like myself to champion having effective systems within the library, or, you know, if you have to, working with the university's HR folks. These are terrific questions. I don't want to miss any of them, but I've got a lot to cover that's nuts and bolts. And so if it's okay, I'm just going to start sprinting through those so we can have time for questions at the end.
We can circle back to these, yes.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to talk about the salary structure that we have for faculty. And so at UF, our faculty have assistants, associates, and universities the highest. And there's a promotion in those through a TMP process, and folks end up getting a 9% raise from the university. The idea is you're hired as an assistant. If you get promoted through this library and university process, you get a 9% raise for that. And then you get it when you become a UL, if you ever do that. So in 2008, so I'm going to be talking about systems that have been around for a while. We formed a committee, a joint committee. I was on it, and we submitted a report in March 2019. And so one of the things that we decided to do was to focus on the ARL Salary Survey. And so you can hear me talk about that, but I think these principles will apply to just about any. And the reason we use the ARL Salary Survey is the University of Florida is an ARL institution. We thought it was comprehensive, or pretty comprehensive, for the job types. It allowed us to compare ourselves to our peers. It had a large data pool, which hopefully increased the validity of the data. And and it's updated annually, which allowed us to revisit it, particularly since we didn't implement this in the first year that we had a plan. And then also it has law and medical library data in case we use that. So this joint committee said the ARL US Public Universities were a really good group for us to think about as our peer institutions. In looking at it, there are some instances in coming up with averages that ARL commingles chairs and unit heads and deans. And we decided we just wanted to look at the non-administrative types like catalogers or subject specialists. We also, in looking at the data, observed that 12 to 15 years with service was about the midpoint when they showed years of service. And we thought that that related to the associate UL, that middle rank for us. These are pretty, I don't know, they're not very inspiring, but they were pretty important fundamental determinations. We also decided that we should use some compensable factors, some locally defined ones. And we wanted to acknowledge people who had more than a master's degree. Our faculty positions require a master's degree. A lot of people have MLSs, but not all. And we also wanted to look at uncommon skills and such as non-English language fluency. There was a discussion that isn't music a language of a kind and isn't chemistry a language of the time. We ended up focusing on non-English language. That was a decision that the deans made, but though there could be different compensable factors. And so we wanted to make sure that their salaries reflected rank and length of service differences for individuals. One of the things that was kind of a challenge was there's not, at least at that time, there were even fewer job codes. So not every type of librarian was represented. And then there were some that were broken into separate groups, like you had subject specialists, which was different than reference librarians, which they had different salary figures for public services. And for us, we had folks who are liaisons. They do all of these things. So those were challenges. And then the other is there's a lot of tables, but sometimes they weren't really great for our purposes. And so we had to kind of derive from this tabular data. We never had the real basic data. And so here's kind of a slide that shows the different tables that we had to pull things from to put together the structure you're going to see. And also these slides are going to be posted, and there's a link to a 1-hour presentation that's only on the salary structure. But I'm going to kind of cover it, to, again, some highlighted practical tips. So we determined that there were variations by region in the United States and also the library type. This is important in determining the midpoints for that external equity element. And so in this chart, you'll see a snip of an Excel file from that ARL Salary Survey. And these are the non-admin type positions that I'm talking about. And so you'll see New England, the University of Florida is in the South Atlantic, and they provide a mean for each one of these, but that's not in and of itself helpful for what we were trying to do. They also provided the sample population for each one of those. So it tells us how many people were in that mean. And so if you took the average salary from the previous chart and this corresponding population data, and you calculated the total salaries from multiplying them, you could calculate a weighted average. And so what does all that mean? What that means is for all of the positions in the South Atlantic that were in these non-administrative type positions, not deans, not unit heads, not branch heads, if you took all that, back when we did this, the weighted average was a salary of $57,983. The weighted average for the entire US was $61,798. When you divide these different regions by that all US figure, you come up with what the difference is for hundreds or thousands of jobs based upon region. And so what that told us was that we could use a modifier when looking at national averages of roughly 94%. There is a step down for the South Atlantic. We also looked at it, whether we should do a step down for publics and versus privates. There's about a 2% difference. Privates pay more, but we decided not to do that. We feel that we compete nationally against all ARL institutions for folks. So variations exist between the regions, like I talked about. We also looked at the health science libraries came to report through the Smathers libraries during this process. And one of the questions was, shouldn't we use MLA? In looking at the ARL numbers, we determined that they were higher than MLA. And so our health sciences colleagues felt that we should use the ARL numbers and not the MLA numbers. The next was really kind of a fundamental shift for us in that different job types have different average salaries. We always considered an associate, regardless of whether they were a cataloger or a reference librarian. But the ARL data tells us that that's different. And some of it was, sort of mildly surprising. Like if you were to look at archivists, and these are broken into two tables because they come from two different places in the ARL data set. Archivists actually do not make more than the subject specialists, reference, public services, which we kind of blended per the weighted average. And so you can see the weighted average and then the step back that we did to get it to 94% because the salaries are lower in the South Atlantic. I'm not saying that's what everyone should do. And obviously there's places that aren't in the South Atlantic, but that's what we did. So the last thing that we found in this analysis was that the data is actually pretty good for years of experience telling us how salaries are arranged. And so this is another one of those tables and those same kind of non-administrative positions. And in the columns, you'll see different levels. This is what ARL uses from 0 to 3 years all the way up to over 35. And so that same kind of process, I calculated weighted averages, looked at for this total population, what the average was. And when you divide the weighted average for each one of these levels of experience, you get a calculation below. And so the lowest is 79% of the average. That's for people with 0 to 3 years of experience. And the weighted average for people with over 35 is 24% higher than the average. And this is, it looks a little messy, but at least we don't have one of these go from like 16 to 19. It goes to 20 and it's actually lower because of something weird. And that gets back to having a large data set. And so it's a relatively orderly progress. So what we did was we made it more orderly. Our average faculty member had about 12 years of experience. And so we said, okay, well, that worked out pretty good. It worked out in the data. So we'll make that the average that we're working towards. And we'll do a 4% step up for every year above that. We'll do a step down for every year below that. And then we already had the figures for 0 to 3 and 4 to 7. The 7 to 8 year, that being about a 9% increase, actually worked out pretty well for us because, again, when you go from an assistant to associate, it anticipates a 9% raise, and that would happen typically at the end of your 7th year. So one of the things that we talked about was adding a 9% increase for non-English language. And there's a variety of factors we could consider. Supervision we handle through stipends, which I won't have time to talk about today. So we have other ways of dealing with that. So our determination was that it's probably harder to hire a fluent French language cataloger in Gainesville, Florida, than it is an English language cataloger. So we considered that a little bit rarer of a compensable factor for the job. So we decided that the individual specific compensable factors, again, would be experience, up or down from that ARL average, rank, which would be up or down from the associate. We would start with the associate because we'd expect you to be there with 12 years. It's a step down for an assistant. It's a step up for a university librarian. And then we decided that if you had advanced degrees beyond the required master's degree, that you would get credit for that. For each master's degree, you would get $2,000 up to a maximum of $5,000. And for a PhD, you would get $5,000. I will admit those are relatively arbitrary numbers. My hope is that you can kind of it may be hard to read some of the numbers, but I hope you'll get the gist of it. That orange arrow is in the midpoint of this range. You'll see that 1. That is the average with the step back for 94% that we wanted to create. And so I'm right in the middle for these associates. And you got different job types. And if you work your way up, I can tell you librarian that we would expect that person, if they had 24 years of experience, to make $77,731. If you go to the bottom of the page, you'll see the step ups for the university librarians, and that would be a 9% increase for each one of these. Again, we would anticipate those people to be making 9% more because they got that promotion. And then if you step down, we don't normally hire assistant university librarians with more than 7 or 8 years of experience. So some of this isn't really relevant, but you'll see the bottom of our scale. We put it at 0.83 instead of the 0.79 because we only wanted it to be 4% below the 4 to 7 years. So we normalized it again. And so you'll see if you are an assistant with 7 years of experience and you go up for promotion and become an associate in your 8th year, we would expect there to be a 9% raise. So here's an example. We have an employee. I did not choose the name Mildred. This is an example that a coworker of mine shared with me. But you have someone and they're being hired as a teaching and learning librarian. And they have a master's and a PhD. They have 9 years of postmasters, and that's what we look for. And so what you're seeing here is an actual kind of anonymized email that we would send to our dean and the chair and the supervisor, if that's not the chair. And we would explain to them, we started with somebody who is a functional specialist. We posted it as either an assistant or an associate. They have a PhD. The orange line tells us is where we're pointing out that they have a master, or they have 9 years of postmasters. So they would be in that 8 to 11 range. And then if you go down to the conclusion, what we're saying is, if you hire that person as an assistant, they should get paid 62, they should be offered 62,924, which is that 57,924 plus 5,000 for that PhD. And the associate would be the 63,160 plus 5,000 for the PhD. I'm going through this quickly, and I apologize for that, but I want to cover a lot of ground, and you guys will have access to these slides. So the outcomes of the system that we created were that we have external equity based upon the job type, those midpoints for the different types of positions. We stepped back for our geographic region, which we think is relevant. Not every institution would do that, but we may not have as much money as every institution. And then we looked at least language. We looked at in whether your position requires a different language than English. We have the stipends, which I mentioned are for admin people. Years of experience, we took care of that and put ranks on top of it as well. And then the educational credentials. And then performance, I don't really have time to talk about it in this part, but I'll talk about how that takes place a little bit later. We apply performance in kind of a consistent way. And so it builds on this system. So I talked a lot and I went through that very quickly, and I apologize for that. But like I've said, I want to cover a lot of real estate because there's a lot of moving parts to bring together. Are there any questions on that, or should we keep going and look at the salary structure for staff?
I will ask 3 quick questions that are kind of related. There's still, just so you're percolating on it, there are questions about advocating and negotiating for salary for others and themselves that are in there that we might save to the end. But particularly, the one question that was in chat, just confirming what the year is for the ARL data that you're using. Was it 2008? Is that right?
Yeah, we ended up using 0910. We looked at it in 08, and it was nice that they still had the same job types. We ended up using 10, and they update it annually. One of the things I'm going to talk to you about at the end is what if they use different job types? And what if you need to refresh this, which I think we may be due for that. So I'll talk about that a little bit at the end.
So relating to refresh is how often do you reevaluate the salary levels? And the other question you can answer at the same time is, I think ARL is not maintaining this data anymore.
No, ARL is doing the annual salary surveys.
Okay.
And they've made some changes to them, which on the one hand are really helpful, but on the other hand, they make you think about your system a little bit better. I think that we're due for a assessment at the Smathers libraries. We are not having trouble recruiting, but you're going to have to look at this thing every 10 or 12 years. And I can tell you it's going to be an expensive proposition. We've tried to maintain it with raises that have come from the university, but I'll talk about it. But ultimately, my belief is it's very unlikely that those are going to keep track with the external market.
I think we should move on for time's sake.
Thank you. So we came up with a salary structure for staff too. So we had really qualified folks, and the pay rates didn't reflect that in the mid-2000s when I came to work at the libraries. And we also had some things like no one could tell you what an LTA supervisor was versus a senior LTA, which was higher. And so we put together a group that would actually come up with a whole new system, the library assistants and associate classifications, and come up with descriptions and examples of duties for us to understand how to go forward with those. The university allowed us to implement those, and we mapped our current employees based upon their position descriptions to the appropriate library assistant or associate level. Assistant 1, 2, 3, associate 1, 2, 3, the associates being exempt. And these were all reviewed through successive levels to look for consistency. And so what we ended up with, this is from 06 ALA APA salary survey data, and they're still generating it, though they don't print it anymore. And so this was the system we came up with. It's elegant. Each of these ranges is 15% below the average, 15% above for a 30% total range. And each range progression is 10%. It is elegant, but it doesn't really tell us what to do with a particular library assistant 2 and how to differentiate them from others. So we had the now what? And so how do we distribute people under this new system that had never existed at UF? And you guessed it, compensable factors. And so we used experience and educational credentials, and the differences between jobs were baked into the classification. And this is what we would use. And so in looking at our data, the average length of experience that people had was about 12 years, and the median was 10 years. And for our existing population, the typical person had a bachelor's degree. And so we came up with 7 levels. We talked about before that you have to have levels for these compensable factors. And so you'll recognize 1.0 as the middle of a range. And so for years of experience, we use 9 to 11. If you were above or below that, you would have a step up or down of 5%. And for education level, we had a step up, but it stopped at the high school level. We do not have anyone that doesn't have a high school degree. Okay, so now for an example. I had a senior archivist who had been here, and their position was mapped to a library associate 2. And I know the average is 35, 450, and 21 cents. This individual had 17 years of experience, and they had a bachelor's degree. And the bachelor's degree is that level 3. So if I take the average of a library associate 2, and I get an average of these 2 compensable factors, we decided to weight them equally. So I take the 1.1 and the 1.0, and I add those together and divide by 2. I end up with someone who's going to make 5% above the middle of their range. And so that's because they have about average education and they have more experience than typical. And we applied this to all of the folks and populated this series. And so employees that had comparable jobs, there was a basis for that. But if they also had, and it was relevant to the external market because we used external data, and but we also distributed based on at least some of these compensable factors. And going forward, as merit was awarded, people would be differentiated based upon their performance. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. And so this builds a lot on the faculty. This is a table that we post this online and use it when we make offers to people. And so that was the staff one. It's kind of a variation on the same theme, but a little bit different. Fewer compensable factors because there's not rank and those sorts of things. The next section for me to talk about is talking about the maintenance of this system. And I don't know if anyone has any question just on the particular to the methodology we use for the staff.
I think, Brian, it might be just for time's sake, so we have time at the end to answer questions that you might move on.
Okay, so how you maintain these things or how you handle offers, individual increases, group increases, salary structure changes, and awareness. And so our salary offers are straight calculations. They're based on those compensable factors. Our salary structures are posted, like I said, and the offers are explained to people when they receive it. We don't haggle, we don't negotiate, and we think that increases distributive justice, procedural justice, and equity. Part of the reason why we think that is the case, it's an unfortunate fact that certain populations feel less empowered to negotiate, and it's also received less well when people negotiate. So we just take negotiating out of it, and we've really stuck to that. We have posted 30 staff positions in 2019. That was a year I went back to. 12 were filled by internal candidates, about 40% of them. So we have people who are promoting up through the system because we have an orderly system, and we consider that to be a good thing. It generates turnover, but it also is a way for people to advance in their career. The same calculation is used for reclassifications, people going up in rank without or classification without it being posted. And we apply this just like we would to an external offer. And we had in 2019, 6 reclasses. We had 11 in 2020. 19 was an odd year. 2020 wasn't that much less odd. So this is about normal that we would see about 9 a year. And so a reclassification is not based upon someone's performance. It is based on the idea that they're fulfilling higher level responsibilities, and they've been doing it for some time. If we want them to do a higher level, then we should think about whether we should post the position, whether the position has changed. And there could be some changes in someone's responsibilities that don't end up resulting in a reclassification, because they're just, kind of, if I supervise one more person, that may or may not, cause me to have a reclassification. We also have a thing called special pay increases. The average of these is about 10%. And we end up with about 4 of these per year. And so when do we do SPIs? We do it when they're temporary, not like someone's on leave, but when a position is vacant and you step up and it takes 6 months to fill it, we'll do an SPI. Or when someone's duties are going to change, but it doesn't really drive a reclassification. They're already an associate 3 and another unit's going to report through them, and the associate 3 is the right place, but they need some consideration. And so I'm going to go back. These end up being somewhere between 5 to 9, sometimes as high as 15%, but these are ways in which we take care of those sorts of things. We also see pool-based raises, which are big group raises. And we had one in 2021 that's not reflected on here, but these are ones that we had seen over about a 3-year period. And we either see a lump sum payment where the legislature says everybody who works for the state should get $1,000. And that is just really a pass-through. It doesn't change our structure. The other are across the board increases. Like they may say, everybody who works at the university gets a 3 or 2 or 1% raise or 4% raise. And we just up those scales. Everyone who works here gets 4%. We up our base salary, we up our midpoint. All of that just gets up by 4%. But merit increases are a little bit different. So these are the distribution of performance outcomes for 2016, 2017. In 2018, the university gave us a pool that was equal to 3% of our salaries to be allocated. And we have this nice distribution of performance evaluations for our staff employees. And so what we did was we took that big one that's right in the middle and said, those will be the folks that get 3%. And there's a 0.5% step down for the lower, but still very good achieves. And then the people above that would get 3.5%. And so the reason we use merit is we have 250 employees. We have to have, the reason we use evaluations for merit is we have 250 employees. We have to have some reasonable basis for this. That data is available. It's quantifiable. It's consistent. It's documented. All these things that you can read for yourself that I'm reading. This is more than you wanted to know about the rationalization for merit raises and tying them to evaluation data. Is evaluation data perfect? No. But I'm unable to think of a substitute that we can apply consistently for 250 employees. And we spend a lot of time, as the last bullet shows, trying to get the evaluations as good as possible. So the last thing I wanted to talk about is, what do you do when ARL updates its table? And they did, the most recent salary survey is 2019-2020. And there are some things on here, like different types of subject specialists, that didn't exist when we did this. There's also digital collection curation, which didn't exist. And so the thing that I would say is, if it's something like cataloger that already existed and you wanted to change the midpoint, you wanted to increase your salary structure, if you look at the existing salary structure midpoint we have for a cataloger and compare it to what we want our new one to be, and it's a 5% increase or a 3% increase or whatever it is, or 20% increase, because all of those things, rank, performance, merit raises, years of experience, because all those are functions of an existing midpoint, if I'm shifting that by 5%, I can just apply 5% to people's current salaries that are classified as a cataloger. If we never had a subject specialist for humanities, but we had some other one, and the increase is 16%, well, I can take that person's salary, their ranks already baked in, their years of experience, their performance over time, all of those things, their education, those are baked in there, and I can just multiply that. And the reason for that are the associative laws for addition and multiplication that we would have learned in algebra. So that's how you shift the whole thing. The last thing I want to talk about for maintaining this, that it's as important as any of these, is communication. Because one of the things we discovered a couple of years ago is we had these elegant systems, but when we did climate qual, people said there's no structure for salaries, they're just made up. Well, you may not appreciate our structures, but they certainly exist, and we've tried to adhere to them. And so one of the things that we do now annually is we do trainings on these topics, because all of these are interrelated to maintaining fair and equitable, just salary structures. So we do these, not only do we do it so people are aware and they understand and they can operate in this system, whether they're a supervisor or a rank and file employee that's worried about their salary, but also, and they can understand the policies and procedures and the who's that are involved, but also we do it so that we can solicit input. And there's some things that we're actually implementing as changes that came from it, like the ability for staff employees to say, when I came here, I had a bachelor's degree, I had a master's degree. I'm working with people who had master's degrees when they came to work here, and they're making more than me. Can we revisit my salary based upon that compensable factor? So those are the things that we're working on. And so at long last, I've covered a lot of real estate. I went through it really fast. I hope that it wasn't frustrating that I skipped over. I think I said all the words, but this is my last question slide. So I'm happy to answer any questions or, to hear observations, but those are some systems that we've implemented. So they're case studies that hopefully are useful for you guys.
Thank you, Brian. Yeah, there are a few questions, and there's been some lively comments in the chat as well. One of the questions that was upvoted is, and this is, I think, communicating externally. It's any tips for how to communicate the importance of a library position in order for justifying the increase in salary. Often state systems and HR do not understand our work or the justifications. Maybe there are some key terms to use. And there was, in the chat, I noticed there were some folks that were saying that, library staff were taking jobs on campus or elsewhere because they're the way that we're classified and not defined properly for the work that they're doing. Yeah,
That's a really tough one. I can tell you when we did the staff one, our director, there was a new head of HR, and the library director, who's the position's now a dean, she made a very impassioned plea and explained to him that they had a guy like me coming in. It was my interview topic when I interviewed for my position. How would you do something like this? And so she got an agreement from the university's HR folks that they could examine this. The guy that was the head of HR was new. She had been here a long time and was persuasive, and it really was terrible. And so I worked closely with somebody in class and comp, and we designed the system for staff first. And having that, was one thing. But then ultimately what we ended up, I mentioned we're a organization of 250 staff and faculty. We used to be an organization of 200 staff and faculty. And we would not have implemented these elegant systems without self-funding them, to be frank. I love the University of Florida, but they would never have given us $800,000 for staff salaries, which is what we ended up putting into them. So, I think on a case-by-case basis, the issue that you have if you champion too hard for one particular position or one particular person is that you create these internal inequities within the system itself. So, I think that the methodologies I've shown, either as someone who's advocating for a position or advocating for a system of positions or advocating for yourself because you think the offer is too low, I think any of these, I think them being grounded in a reasonable external midpoint for your peers or the peers of the institution and being able to point to compensable factors is the most solid foundation. And again, I say that, but we've tried to avoid people having to do that because we explain to them how the system works to do that. That's not an entirely satisfactory answer, but maybe your director could hire a consultant if the university HR office and somebody with compensation management background that can help build a case.
Okay. There's some more questions. I'm going to combine a couple of these here. One person says they love the ease of this kind of system, but they're concerned about all the reliance on the market, which reinforces systematic biases, and on things like educational attainment, which is well documented to be more accessible by white folks. Do you have any flexibility to account for this? And then another related question about is when using experience as a compensable factor, does that include prior experience at other libraries? I worry about the concept of seniority within an organization can unfairly disadvantage BIPOC folks who are working within primarily white institutions who may often move in between jobs.
Yeah, the education piece is a thing, but I don't have a satisfactory answer. But on the other hand, if someone has a PhD, they have lost those years of potential employment and are carrying debt for that more than likely. So on the other side, you could argue that that person, what they're doing compared to me, who does not have a PhD, that they should receive some additional consideration. But baked into any of these systems, and the best we try for the merit to be allocated upon fair evaluations, it's still premised upon that system. The things that are baked into promotion at an academic institution for faculty, all of those are there. And this is not a perfect system from that standpoint, and I readily acknowledge it. And I think there's work to be done. The thing I would say for experience is for library faculty, we require everyone to have a master's degree as a minimum qualification. And so we start at their first master's degree. And so any experience that's related, so they could be doing instruction in a junior high, in a junior college, and they're going to be our STEM instruction librarian, we'll count that. Or they could be doing environmental field work and they're going to be, our chemistry librarian, we would count that as if it was postmaster. So we're pretty liberal about that, but it has to be postmasters, and we've stuck to that being consistent because we just don't want to start making, again, people that once you open it up to negotiation, even if you're trying to do it for the right reasons, it causes me concerns. For our staff, we will use really a lot of different types of experience, customer service experience. It's not just other libraries. So we would consider retail experience to be something that would be helpful at a CERC desk. And so it's really expansive what we do there. And on some level, it may mitigate. We certainly think it makes it easier for people to qualify for jobs and to get credit for them. And we do think those experiences are useful. Hopefully, to some extent, it would also mitigate some other biases. And again, I think fundamentally the idea of someone not having to argue or negotiate and challenge, which is implicit in both of those, and by us being able to point to people and say, this is how we came up with it, I think that's probably the strongest thing we're doing towards equity and inclusivity that's in this system. So,
yeah, I mean, personally, I like that, you're being evidence-based in what you're doing. You're trying to be transparent. And so those are all good things. But some other questions to get to. Did you consider generally low pay within the library field when benchmarking against the market? That is, any consideration of paying more to help adjust the market? Like, so if you paid somebody more, would that help library? It's a social justice thing to get everybody raise the all tide. How's that say it? The boat in the tide.
Yeah, the beauty of my job is that I work with the people in fiscal services who don't want to spend money, and I work with the people in HR who everything they do is spend money. If you think about it, there's nothing an HR office does that doesn't cost money. In either paying people or recruiting for people or whatever they do, it costs money. And so I'm the person who tries to find the money for us to do these. And there's some things that we're talking about doing, like the thing for staff, where if you get a degree, we revisit your salary. That's going to cost money. So the University of Florida, and we post we're transparent about our finances too. We post those online. We do monthly budget reports. And I also do peer analysis. We are really not in a position to lead the market. I wish we were. And so the best, I mean, when we did the faculty, when it was $700,000, when we did, I mean, these are just huge investments that even getting us approximate to the average it made such big changes in people's pay that it's not the ideal, but it was, it was a big deal. So I appreciate it, but I don't know. And, I think you could say that about the ARL data for sure, that it's in, that the market itself is suppressed, but it is the market. And these are the folks that we're competing against, for your services. And since we implemented this, we have the most qualified staff and faculty, library employees, whatever type, that we've ever had before. So I think it's positioned us to do better. But it is the sort of thing you're going to have to come back to. So,
speaking of your faculty and staff, how are these models perceived by your faculty and staff? Are your people satisfied with them?
I think so. I think that like right now, like the question we're getting is, if we get a raise this summer from the university, is it going to be 8% because the cost of living is going to up 8%? I don't know what the percent is. If it could be 0, but I can pretty much guarantee you it's not going to be 8%. So people have very practical concerns. And I think they understand that as a field, if you have a PhD and you're working in, special and area studies in the libraries, it's different than other markets for your salary. So I think all of that is there. But if you go back to the research that's been done in compensation management, I think people, when we do a good job of explaining these, I think people do believe that there's procedural and distributive justice and they're being treated fairly within the system, and that we're not compressing people into them, that someone's being hired straight out of library school or, with 3 years and a high school degree for an assistant 3 position, whatever the position is, they can have confidence that we don't have people compressing into them. And, but there's some things we're doing, that last bullet, which is communication, that, is really, hopefully helping people, because they don't think about this stuff all the time. And so, just helping people understand the system we have and helping them suggest ways to improve it. I think it's generally well received, but everyone would like to be paid more. I could have just said that instead of all those other words.
So maybe one more kind of summary question from some of these. A lot of the questions and comments have been about advocating for salary, either as administrator for your staff or against fixed salary schedules. Do you have some additional advice, ideas, strategies that people can do to advocate for themselves, for others, in relation to inflation and other things that are going on too? So some of the environmental things, just some general salary advocation.
Yeah, I think regardless of whether it's inflation or you've been compressed or those sorts of things, I really think whether you use those words or not, the idea that you have something that's based upon a reasonable approximation of where the salary for your job type or that job type should be, in some reasonable compensable factor that differentiates you from this other person. And it could be experience, education, or performance. Something else, it could be job-based as well. And there would be a lot of those things, the complexity of systems, that slide as well. I think using that language for me is an effective way to do it. I think if you're in a system where the legislature establishes the salaries, I mean, that's really something for the State Library Association. I mean, somebody like myself who's pretty good in Excel and can read these salary surveys and has, some of this experience and training isn't going to be able to help in lobbying. I think I would hope that what we did at UF, with the understanding that nobody did this for us and that we had to be able to put forward a compelling argument. And anything we do in the future, we'll have to do the same. We're going to have to go to our provost and say, we're behind, we need to put $500,000 in. And by the way, we'll be asking for $800,000 more in materials next year. Those round numbers, please don't tell the provost at UF, those are real numbers. But I mean, those are part of the thing. I think if you follow the breadcrumbs we do, if you're a library director, hopefully this explains a rational methodology for coming up with a number for engaging people or just comparing your average salary to those weighted averages. So I think, because like I said, nobody did this for us. We had to be aggressive with the university because, like any other priority we have, it's not necessarily the university's number one priority, though in principle they may agree with it. So my hope is that these case studies position people in different types to think about salaries in different ways, in ways that are practical. And, Rick, I think you used evidence-based or, that are based upon something, that positions people to take them to the circumstances they're trying to improve.
Yeah, Brian, thank you for the presentation. I think people are impressed with the work that's been done, especially like you're saying that you're doing it in-house and no one asked you to, per se, and the transparency and showing that this can be done at other places. There is a question asking if you're available for consultations.
I am. I'm happy. I'm happy to, and I'm also happy just to share like spreadsheets and stuff like that we've done, to position people to be able to do this. But I would be, on occasion, I do talk to either a library director or I talk to a committee that's been charged. And you can find my email address at the University of Florida, in our directory. I'd be happy to talk to people and give you some help.
Well, thank you, Brian, for your time and your expertise. If everybody would like to give an emoji or thank you to Brian in chat, I'm sure he'd appreciate it. So thanks, Brian, for talking.
Thank you very much.
Please look for the evaluation for the session, the link for that, and have a good rest of your